So, my name is Gary Lucas. I'm 67 years old, and I grew up in the Cold War years. I was a little bit too young to go to Vietnam. I've lived in New Jersey my whole life. And in fact, I've lived within 5 miles of where I was born my whole life. I was born in Trenton, and my parents moved to Robbinsville, and I now live in Hightstown, and so it's only about 5 miles away, and I've never moved any further. And my parents used to go to the Florida Keys, and of course the Florida Keys are down near Cuba, and one of the trips we made down there was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, I believe it was. And in 62, I was only 9 years old. So I was born in 1953. And, but I remember that we had missile batteries stationed along the road going down to Key West. And I clearly remember that. And we used to listen to radio from Cuba at this friend's house that we were staying at, and we would listen to the Cubans talking about what was going on and stuff. And it was a very tense time, and of course it was President Kennedy at the time, and it was scary to some degree. Except that the friend that I stayed with said, "Oh, you don't have to worry about the missiles. We're so close that by the time they fire them, they'll be past us." And because Key West is only 90 miles from Cuba, okay. And in fact, the railroad was being built down to Key West for the purpose of actually making the railroad extend all the way to Cuba. That was the original intent of settling the Florida Keys. And so that was, interesting. What they call the Cold War, I did not wind up going to Vietnam because I was in college, and they had done away with virtually all deferments, and they had gone to a system of a draft. And you got a draft number in a lottery, and then when they called up for troops, they would use the lottery to figure out who goes first. It's a number you never forget. My number was 27. If Nixon hadn't ended the war, I'd have probably wound up going to Vietnam, except possibly I'd have gotten a deferment due to the fact that my eyes were very, very bad. When I was growing up, my vision was 21,000. I could see clearly to the end of my nose. So a soldier whose glasses got knocked off and couldn't find his way around the base would have been probably more of a problem than a help. But Nixon ended the war, and as he said he would, and we all continued on with college. One of my friends, his lottery number was 1. He stopped going to classes, he was partying. It went on for 3 weeks, and then they declared an end to the war, and he was behind in all his classes, and he had to make up the time. And he was really upset about that, because he was a straight A student, and so he would screwed up his grade point average with this. And so the whole thing of the Cold War is really about something called MAD, which is mutually assured destruction. What really made it a Cold War was that the advent of the atomic bombs that we dropped in World War II changed the whole face of warfare. It was now possible for a single plane to destroy an entire city in one shot. And so what happened was there was a mad rush by both the US and the Russians to build more nuclear weapons. And I don't know if you knew this, but when we dropped 2 bombs on Japan before they surrendered, and we had no more. there were no more bombs to be had. We could not have hit them a third time. If they hadn't surrendered, it would have been a real problem. But the advent of the atomic bomb totally changed this, because now you could do so much damage. And there's no defense for an atomic bomb. There's no way to stop it. There's no protection for it. And so what happened was, the only way of guaranteeing someone would not use an atomic bomb on your country was for you to have an atomic bomb as well. And so there was a mad rush to build atomic bombs, and guaranteeing this mutually assured destruction, where if the US attacked Russia, we would be certain that we would be wiped out as well. And the Russians the same way. And that has been what has kept the peace, actually, for the last 50 years, okay? Is that neither one of us could afford to actually take the other one to war. And so the other thing that happened, though, is that it was a crazy time. We had drills when we were kids, you know, duck and cover in case there was an atomic attack, which was, it was really just something to keep people from being scared out of their wits, because the usefulness of it was pretty much zero. And we built a lot of bunkers and that kind of thing. For a while there, people were building their own bomb shelters all over the place. I'm not so sure that they would have been really effective, but people were crazy about building them and so on. And of course, the U.S. built missile bunkers and missile silos. And at one point, the United States had 10,000 nuclear weapons, as did the Russians. So if a war had started, the results would have been really, really, really terrible. There's no question that would have been, it would have been the end of civilization. And as I understand, through treaties, we've now reduced the number of warheads that the US and Russia have down to about 1,500 each, which is still a lot. And part of it is that after World War II and the 2 bombs dropped on Japan, they were fission bombs. And then I believe in around 1960, in the 50s and 60s, we developed the thermonuclear bomb, the fusion bomb. And that was another game changer, because the first fusion bomb that we set off was nearly 1,000 times more powerful than either of the bombs we dropped on Japan. And since then, the Russians have actually built one that was 100 million, it was 100 megatons, 100 million tons of TNT equivalent. And only one has ever been fired that size. And as I recall, the results were so devastating that they never tested another one. It just, you know, it was incredible. So, you know, both countries were, we didn't go to war, we just built our armies up. And then, of course, there was the space race, and the Russians beat us into space with the first satellite, Sputnik. And then we came back and launched a satellite, and of course they beat us into space with a man as well, and we came back with John Glenn being the first American astronaut to go into orbit. And it's kind of interesting, because my grandmom used to take care of us. My grandmom was, both of my grandparents' families were immigrants. All 4 of them came through Ellis Island. And we visited Ellis Island, and we found their names on the wall in Ellis Island. And my mom's parents were from Poland, and my dad's parents were both from England. And there's a poignant thing here. My grandmother, my mom's mother, never learned to speak English. And I found that very sad because to us, she was a crazy old lady that yelled in a foreign language we didn't understand. And so my relationship with my mom's mother was pretty much non-existent. And I guess her father had left the family, and I don't remember. I don't remember ever meeting him, but I remember my grandmother. But like I said, she was a crazy old Polish lady, and it was sad that she never learned enough English to talk to us. My dad's mother, and my dad's father was profoundly deaf. So it was tough for us to talk to him, but I can remember him sitting in his chair, and I guess I didn't mention, I have a brother and a sister. I'm the oldest, and my sister is 4 years younger than me, and my brother's 8 years younger than me. So neither one of those remember my mom's parents, because my mom's mother passed away from complications of diabetes. She had had a leg amputated, and she did not do well. My other grandmother, who was from England, Polly, my parents would go on vacation, and we would stay with and she would come over and stay at our house and take care of us. And interestingly, she was there for some of the big moments. When Kennedy was killed, my grandmother was taking care of us at the time. When they landed on the moon, my grandmother was taking care of us at the time. And so it was, I remember her well, because there were, these important moments in history that happened when we were there, when she was there. And she lived to 96. Of course, she grew up going to school in a horse-drawn carriage. And when she was in her late 60s, she went back to England for the first time and flew on a jet plane to go there, a Boeing 707. And so in a lot of ways, she saw an incredible amount of history of the U.S., from wagons to cars and trains and airplanes and jet planes and man on the moon, and her 96 years covered a lot of things that happened. And now that I'm in my late 60s, I realize that I've seen a lot as well. Not the same stuff, but I've seen the advent of the cell phone and computers, of course, and so it's the world's still changing rapidly. In fact, the world's changing faster all the time. It really is. So I did, in fact, in 1978, I actually visited the Soviet Union. The Cold War had more or less gone away, and we more or less won by virtue of we had a very, very much more powerful economy than the Russians, and they basically went broke trying to compete with us in the Cold War. They spent enormous sums of money on their military, as we did, but they didn't have the GDP to support that kind of spending, and so they pretty much went broke. That was it was amazing to see the Soviet Union break up, and that happened after I went to the Soviet Union, and we actually went. I actually went on this trip with the choir from Trenton State College. And I was not a singer, but they said, we have room on the trip and we need people to carry luggage. And Channel 52, New Jersey Public Television, was going to shoot a documentary. So I did, in fact, carry luggage for the cameraman, because it was shot on 16 millimeter professional camera, and and we had this really fancy tape recorder that they carried around, and so I followed the cameraman around and carried gear for him and stuff. And what was interesting was at one point, I'm a techie. I never go anywhere without tools. And a week into the trip, camera broke and wouldn't record anymore. And so they were lamenting what to do, and we were sitting in a hotel room, and the camera was sitting there on the bed, and I said to them, I said, well, why don't we try to fix it? And they said, oh, we don't have any tools. I said, well, I've got tools. You got tools? Yeah. I said, I brought them with me. So I went back to my room and I got the tools, and I took this camera apart, and I had it all apart on the bed, and I said, wow, this thing is beautiful. It's really nicely made. The guy says, yeah, and it cost $40,000. It's like, and you let me take it apart? And he's like, yeah, if it doesn't work, it's useless. So as it turned out, we found a little tiny clip inside that had popped off, and his axle had moved out of the way and jammed it. And I found the clip, and I put the axle back, put the clip back on, and the camera ran fine for the rest of the trip. So we brought back some great video of it. The trip was 10 days in Romania, 10 days in Russia. And we flew to Romania first, and then we flew over to Russia. And I have to tell you that after seeing Russia firsthand, I was no longer fearful of Russia, because it was obvious that they were so far behind us, it wasn't funny. It was amazing. And in fact, an interesting piece of propaganda. A week before we went on this trip, there was a major power failure in New York City, and the power went off over the entire city, most of the East Coast. Well, when we got to Moscow, the Russian people kept asking us how terrible things must be in New York City without power for 2 weeks. And we're like, what do you mean? Well, their newspapers announced that the power went out in New York City, but they never announced that the power ever came back on. And so the Russian people, everywhere we went, Moscow, Leningrad, Riga, thought that the power was off in New York City all this time. And they would ask us, how bad are things without power in a major city? And the power had come back on the same day. And so they, with total control of that's, the Russians were able to keep it, quiet that the power came back on. The other interesting thing in Russia was dollar stores. Dollar stores were stores that would take the American dollar and the Deutschmark and a couple of other currencies, and that's all they would accept. And we were warned time and time again, do not trade money on the black market, and we're like, we wouldn't know anything about trading money on the black market. As it turns out, what happened was there were beer stands everywhere. There was no fresh water. I saw in the entire trip, I saw one water fountain. Everywhere else it was beer stands with a glass that was upside down in it, and it sprayed some kind of liquid up into the glass, and you drank from the same glass as everybody else. That was the way it was done. But what happened was they took us to a bank, and we traded dollars for rubles. And at the time, the exchange rate was $2.71 to the ruble, right? So one of the students had changed like, I don't know, $10 or something, and he wanted to buy some beer or something. And he went to a stand that he had run out of rubles, and so he pulls out a $5 bill and he hands it to the guy and says, can you, take this? And the guy took the bill and quick made change. and he walked away, and he was counting his change, and he's like, "Whoa, this guy made a mistake." And he went back to tell the guy that he had given him too much money back. And the guy was like, "No, no, no, go away." So we all walked away. Well, it turned out that the black market rate was $10 to the ruble. So for his $5, the guy gave him 50 rubles in change and the official rate was 271. And so that's how we found out, oh, so that's how you trade money on the black market. You just pull out an American bill and hand it to any vendor and you get change. So it was a very interesting trip. And again, the Cold War had just ended, and when we got home about 2 years later, the dictator in Romania, where we'd been, Ceausescu, was taken out in a coup, and Romania was a gorgeous country, gorgeous, backwards, not 50 years, not 100 years, 400 years. If you fell out of a plane and landed in the middle of Romania, you would never know that you were, if somebody said, oh, the year is 1600 and something, you'd have had to believe it because there was nothing to indicate that it was any farther in the future. It was amazing, but it was a gorgeous country, gorgeous. So, yeah, so the Cold War, was, it was scary in a way. I have to tell you, things are way more scary right now. Way more scary. It was okay when the Russians had nukes and we had nukes. We were on a par, and we're both big enough countries that neither one wanted to start a war, and I don't think our leaders were crazy enough to do it. But there are certainly enough little countries around the world with leaders who aren't crazy enough to start a war, and they have nuclear weapons now. And I suspect that the only thing keeping them at bay is that I think everybody pretty much sure that if you start a war with a nuclear weapon, your country will cease to exist. And so, but there are scary forces out there. There's a lot going on, and so. Do you have any questions you want to ask me? I didn't mean to keep going, but.
No, I think we hit everything, actually. I think we hit everything.
All right. I've been very, very fortunate. I've grown up in an age when I've never known anything but peace, which is unusual. My grandparents went through World War I and World War II. My dad joined the Navy, and the war ended 2 years into his thing. And he joined the Navy and wound up on a transport ship. And when the war ended, he wound up going all over the world, bringing soldiers back from every country. So my dad visited China and Japan and the Philippines and England, the west coast of the U.S. And his ship went everywhere because it was a troop transport, and they were bringing back all these soldiers that had gone overseas. And so he had some fabulous stories of the things that went on on a troop transport, because they didn't see any battle. They didn't see any fighting, and there was a lot of boredom, and there was a lot of people on board. They brought the families back too, and nurses and stuff, and so it was. It almost sounded like party times on board the ship more than wartime, which of course it was. And an interesting thing happened when the war ended. They offered everybody on his ship to end their enlistment now, 2 years early, and if they, but they had to sign up as a reservist, and all of my dad's friends on the ship took the offer and got out of the Navy and signed up as reservist, and my dad didn't. My dad liked the Navy, liked what he was doing, and so he stayed in the Navy for 2 more years. And then he got out, and the Korean War started, and they called up all of his buddies, and they all had to go serve for 4 more years in the Korean War. So he was he stayed friends with his Navy buddies right up until a few years before he passed away, and they always brought up the fact that he didn't serve in the Korean War. So yeah. So my dad was an electrician. He was an electrician, but he was working for an electrician before he went in the Navy. He went in the Navy and got training as an electrician there. When he came out, he became an electrician again. And but as I said, I missed the Vietnam War by that much, and I missed I was then old enough to miss the both of the Gulf Wars, and so the closest I've gotten to anything like that was when the planes hit the World Trade Center, and I can tell you I was working from home at the time, and I was sitting in my office, which was over there, and I heard on the radio that the plane hitting a plane had hit a building, and I didn't know what building, and I heard that, and they said, oh, it's worse than when the plane hit the Empire State Building, which happened in like 1929. And I walked in the other room, and there was a picture on the TV was a picture of the Trade Center, and with smoke coming out of it. What was interesting was that when I was in college, I was going to Stevens, which is in Hoboken, and my dorm room was right on the bluffs overlooking the Hudson River, and the Trade Center was like right to my right, and the Empire State Building was right to my left, and I knew a little bit about the Trade Center because they were building it as I was in college, and it was designed by an engineer from Stevens, and so it was a topic of conversation. So when I saw on TV, and they were saying, oh, they thought it was a small commercial plane, a private plane, and I looked at the building and I was like, no, that building's 200 feet wide. This was a large airplane, and of course, a few minutes later, a second one, I hit it. And in fact, at the time, I was working for somebody whose religion did not allow TV. And when the second plane hit, I picked up the phone and I called him. I said, I know you don't watch TV, but you need to go find a TV and see what's going on. We're under attack. And he said, how do you know we're under attack? I said, 1 plane is an accident, 2 is an attack. There's no way that 2 planes hit the same building. And of course, shortly after that, the one hit the Pentagon and the one went down in Pennsylvania. And you could see the smoke from here rising from the trade centers. Also, what was chilling was the fact that I knew something about how the Trade Center was built. And so when it collapsed, I was watching on TV when it collapsed, and in my mind, I knew exactly how it was coming down and how, why it collapsed the way it did, because of the way it was built. It was a very unusual structure, and so it fell straight down within itself, and you guys are all young enough that this happened before you were born, so it's but that was the closest I've gotten to any of that stuff. And of course, they grounded all the airplanes, and for several weeks, and the air cleared up. We had really clear skies for a while. My brother actually was an electrical contractor and actually got a contract to light up a big field in Jersey City, where they brought all the debris from the building so they could search through it for remains. They just picked it up with cranes and bulldozers and front end loaders and dumped it on barges and brought it across the river and laid it out on the thing. And so his company lit up the field with like sports lighting and so they could have like daylight during it at night. And they would work 24 hours a day on it. So that was an eye opener. And of course, it wasn't part of the Cold War. It was part of the issues in the Middle East and such. So, but like I said, I've been fortunate. I've seen peace my whole life, and I guess not too many Americans have been that fortunate. You know, there's always been something going on around the world, and I've just I was either too young or too old. And, so, you know, and you kids, of course, have grown up without the draft and other things. In fact, I was in California one time, and I was 21, and I was out there working, and I was trying to get in a bar, and they asked for ID, and I pulled out my draft card, and oh, that's no good. And it's like, are you crazy? Nobody fakes a draft card. You might fake a driver's license. Nobody fakes a draft card. They burned them, you know. They threw them away. Nobody wanted a draft card. So yeah, but yeah, they wouldn't take it. But interestingly, they would take a credit card. So yeah, it was funny. But, yeah. So.
Well, thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah. This is a great country. When we came back from Russia, you never heard so much cheering on one airplane. We were all very glad to be home. The differences were so stark. And I'm of the opinion that every kid in the U.S., when he turns 18, should be handed a passport and sent overseas. And go anywhere. I don't care where you go. I think that our attitudes about things would be a lot more positive if you were forced to go take a look for real and see what the rest of the world is really like. And there's a lot of nice places, but even the nice places have their underbelly and things that are, that are not so nice. You know, China's doing amazingly well. The Chinese cities are amazing. But when you remember that China's got 1 billion people, there isn't 1 billion people living in those cities. There's maybe 200 million, you know, and the rest of the country is really, really poor. And Russia was very similar. In fact, we traveled. It's interesting. We traveled by overnight train between Moscow and Leningrad and Riga, and the only thing they served us on a 12-hour trip was some hot tea made by a little old lady with this boiler fired by coal. And we were all laughing that the reason the Russians hadn't beat us to the moon was they hadn't figured out how to put enough coal in the rocket. Of course, for the past 9 years, we've been buying rides on a Russian rocket to get to the space station. So, you know, what goes around comes around, I guess. Anyway.
Thank you for sharing your story.
I know you'll edit the heck out of it, and that's fine.